Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak about the Tweed Meadows project progress as we are 1 year into the project. In fact, I started almost a year ago today. Um, this photo in the background of my title slide is Needpath Castle over at Peebles. This was actually my first day in the job last November. It's a very undergrazed grassland, so it gives you a bit of an idea of what I turned up to last year. So normally when I give this talk, I start off with a little bit of a crash course on species grassland identification, but I'm sure many of you are already familiar with these habitats, so I'll move on to what I really want to tell you about, which is the project progress so far. I'm going to show you some before and after pictures of our project sites. And then I'm going to tell you about the challenges we've encountered. There have been many. It's been a really interesting learning experience, so I think it's really important to share that. And then finally, onto our future plans. So we have already heard this morning just how valuable and threatened grasslands are. We've all heard that horrifying figure that we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows in less than a century, which, as Alistair pointed out already, is likely to be underestimated. The science tells us that species-rich grasslands are part of a healthy, functioning ecosystem, and research is increasingly recognizing the importance of grasslands as carbon storage. We also know that loss of floral habitat from the landscape is the driving factor behind pollinator decline. And I think for me personally, being from the borders, having spent most of my life on a farm in the borders, meadows are much more than that. They're part of our cultural heritage. The borders is a rich farming landscape, and until relatively recently, hay meadows would have been such an important part of the farming calendar. Grasslands have inspired people for thousands of years, and I very much hope they continue to do so. There are many different types of grassland, as we've mentioned already this morning. I normally use this slide to teach people about the broad types they might encounter in the borders. However, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. There are different monitoring surveys and scorecards that can be used to assess whether a site is considered to be species rich or not. But I usually say to people, if you're standing in one of these three species rich examples and you look down at your feet, you're going to see texture, different leaf shapes, grasses, colors, which is very different to the improved grassland, which we are much more familiar with seeing. So this improved grassland is near my home on the Southern Upland Way, and I know that it would have once been species rich because the verges are filled with beautiful wildflowers that would have once been widespread across this hillside. But at some point, it's been reseeded with perennial ryegrass, white clover, which these species grow very vigorously for feeding livestock, and it's outcompeted our native wildflowers. In the background, you can also see the next biggest threat to grasslands in the borders, which is, of course, commercial forestry plantations. So our sites mostly focus on neutral grasslands. They're located mainly centrally in the borders. So they're lowland MG5 hay meadows, which are characterized by species like common knapweed, oxeye daisy, bird's foot trefoil, crested dog's tail. We have a couple of sites that are on higher ground and they lean towards being more acidic. One site in particular is filled with beautiful harebells. We're not actively working on any calcareous grassland, which some of you might be familiar with if you're involved with monitoring for northern brown Argus butterflies. And we have a couple of sites that are improved, so we're creating meadows from scratch here rather than just trying to restore them. So the Tweed Meadows project was created in response to the losses and threats that we've already heard about this morning. Our mission is to take meaningful action on the ground to restore and create meadows across the Scottish borders. If you don't know much about the Tweed Meadows project or Merlindale Nature, the idea very much came from when one of the directors of Merlindale, David Lindhot, created a meadow on his land at Merlindale, and he encouraged some of his neighbours to do the same as well and to get involved. And it was quite successful. They created this nice little network of hay meadows in their area. And then an idea started to form that this could be a much bigger project. It could be at a landscape scale. And so, alongside Ruben, who's here today, an application was put into the Nature Restoration Fund. And early this year, we were awarded £180,000 by Nature Scot, which was topped up by the South of Scotland Enterprise and the Falago Environment Fund. This money allowed us to purchase equipment, which we had already identified as being a barrier to people being able to create meadows on their land. We also were able to purchase 600 kilograms of wildflower seed. If you want to kind of visualize what that looks like, it filled my entire garage for 2 weeks before we found somewhere to store it. It also allowed us to hire staff, so myself part-time and Maxine, who's no longer with the project, but her bookkeeping skills were really critical at the start as we ordered all of this machinery. And we've also spent money on engagement as well, so creating leaflets and signage. We have around 25 sites that were part of the original application to Nature Scot. So we're actively involved in managing those 25 sites with equipment and our funds for contractors and wildflower seed. But since then, we have had a lot of people approach us as well, looking for advice. So altogether, we're probably involved with around about 34 or 35 sites in the Scottish Borders to date. And since we started work in February, we have started restoration or creation on around 55 hectares of meadow in the Scottish Borders, roughly following the River Tweed. Our sites range in size from around about half a hectare right up to large sites, 7 hectares in size. We have small, kind of average sized gardens, not many, but there's a couple in the project. We have a lot of historic houses involved in the project, and these tend to have sites that are have been very manicured lawn for a long time, so often a lot of chemical input, very intensively managed. We have medium-sized sites, so paddocks that are usually attached to a farmhouse or a cottage, often used for grazing horses. These are usually around about half a hectare in size. And then moving on to larger estates and farmland, which goes from, roughly 1 hectare right the way up to our largest site, which is 7 hectares. And in response to these very varied sites, we had to purchase a lot of different equipment. So top left, we have our Trackmaster, which is manual kit, which we use for the small garden sites and also as a backup for some of the smaller paddocks as well. So you can see the body of the machine there, and in front of it, it has a 1.5 meter scythe bar, which is very effective for long, even wet grass. It also comes with various attachments. So there's a scarifier, a hay rake, and a mini baler, which produces tiny round hay bales. We have also tried to incorporate some traditional methods into the project. So we have quite a lot of horse-drawn equipment as well. I was initially quite skeptical, and if you've ever been to the Merlindale Nature Festival and seen Billy Anderson try to cut the meadow there with his vintage horse mower, you'll understand why. But actually, this red horse-drawn mower came over from America. It's a modern bit of equipment that is used quite frequently on small holdings over there, and it works fantastically. It was able to cut through very long, wet grass. So we've worked with Clydesdale horses here in the Borders, and also Belgian Ardennes horses, which came over from Dumfries and Galloway. So we've got the horse-drawn mower, we've also got a chain harrow, a hay rake, and a medium-sized baler that can all be pulled by horses, which is useful for sites that are difficult to access, and also great for public engagement as well. Down here we have our Amazon machine, which is a cut and collect machine often used by local authorities on public green space. It's really our kind of wet weather backup option. So in a really wet summer where you can't make hay, you could use this machine to cut and collect and have a sacrificial corner of the field where you can leave the cuttings. We also have lots of livestock involved in the project. So cattle, sheep, ponies, even pigs have been used. But with respect to equipment, we purchased a set of no-fence collars to use on some of the cattle involved in the project. Really amazing bit of technology. If you don't know much about it, basically the farmer will draw a virtual fence line on a mobile phone application. And as the cow wearing the collar walks up to that virtual fence line, it will start to hear audible beeping noises, warning it. If it keeps going, it will get the same kind of shock that you would get from an electric fence. And they're very quick to learn. So they usually will only get shocked once or twice before they learn that as soon as they hear this beeping noise, they turn around and walk back the other way. And as soon as a couple of cattle in the herd start to learn this, they obviously all start to move as a herd. So really effective for targeted grazing of very undergrazed sites. So our rough timeline, unfortunately, due to just when we received our money and when we were able to purchase our seed, we were a little bit late to get going. So end of January this year, we received our seed and started to prepare the ground. If you're thinking of making a meadow, really you want to be getting the seed in the ground round about now. As soon as possible, definitely this side of Christmas would be best, because the seed really does like to experience around 4 months of cold weather for successful germination. We do have a bit of leeway here in Scotland, of course. We can have frosts up until May. I know that I've certainly seeded yellow rattle in my garden kind of end of February, and I've been lucky that there's been a really cold snap after that, and it's worked perfectly fine. But this year we started in late January. We started to scarify our sites that needed seed putting into them through a variety of methods. So our trackmaster, our horse and tractor drawn chain harrows, and contractors using disc harrows as well. Some of the smaller sites we just did by hand with volunteers. And the idea was to expose at least 50% of bare soil in which to seed. Where possible, we then left livestock on the fields until late March. This helps with trampling the seed into the ground, but I've also found that particularly light sheep grazing is very good for suppressing that early burst of grass growth that can outcompete some of our native species. The meadows were then shut up for the summer, so roughly from April to August, allowing them to bloom and, more importantly, to set seed as well. And then they were cut, grazed, or both at the end of summer. So sites that were very, very fertile and we need to remove nutrients from them, we tried to cut and lift, followed up by aftermath grazing where possible. But in some cases, it did depend on proximity to farmers who are helping us out and contractors. But this is the rough cycle that we followed. So now on to some photos of our sites. So I'll start off with the smaller garden type sites. The top one is a kind of average sized new build property. They knew they wanted to create a wildflower meadow, so they removed the topsoil to get rid of any agricultural seeds, weeds still in the seed bank. And the idea was to create a wildlife garden where they could engage their grandchildren, which they did. So this site was quite late to get going. I think it was because it was completely bare soil. When you've got yellow rattle, which is a hemiparasite, you do want to be putting it into a site where there is a bit of grass already, but it was also very cold, very wet. But eventually it did get going, and late in the summer we had the yellow rattle coming through, red clover, bird's foot trefoil, vetches. So that site worked really well, and I really like that it shows what you can do with quite a small space. King's Meadows house in Peebles was an interesting one because we were starting with manicured lawn, but also the house here is split up into apartments, and kind of just over half the house were very pro-meadow and the rest of the house were very anti-meadow. So we had some engagement work to do here. We spoke to the residents and sorry, explained to them that houses like King's Meadows were very important as grasslands disappear from the wider countryside. They had a really important role to play in conserving and creating pockets of species-rich grassland. I think the main worry was that the grass was going to grow very, very long, and it was going to take a while for the wildflowers and the perennials to come through. So they might kind of lose momentum and not like the untidy appearance. But actually, what happened here is it formed a really beautiful kind of flowering carpet. It didn't grow too long, actually. It consisted mainly of low-growing species like birdsfoot trefoil, self-heal, eyebrights, and they formed this really beautiful mosaic, a kind of flowering lawn. And the residents absolutely loved it, I'm pleased to say. I was there again last week doing a bit more seeding, so this one was a success. Moving on to some of the kind of paddock-sized sites. There's a couple of paddocks here near Selkirk. They're quite overgrown. They're used occasionally in a rotational grazing system for ponies. They were very encroached by common hogweed. So what happened here was I asked the person who manages the fields to graze the sward down really, really low with these lovely Herdwick sheep that he has. So we grazed it down really low. When I turned up, there was actually quite a lot of bare ground already. So I seeded straight into the bare ground and asked Hamish to put the livestock back on to trample the seed back into the ground. And in summer, it looked very beautiful, filled with red clover, lots of yellow rattle here, meadow buttercup, yarrow, vetches, meadow grasses, really, really, really nice. And I was concerned about this site because it was one of the last sites to be seeded. So I was really worried about the yellow rattle, but I think that having the livestock on straight afterwards to trample the seed in was really beneficial. Next up, we have another paddock, but this one was grazed very intensively by horses for a very long time, so it was extremely fertile. Very little diversity here. Same situation, I grazed it down and arrived, and there was lots of bare ground to seed straight into. The horses trampled the seed back in. However, this site is very fertile, as I said. It's an example of a site that's going to take time to restore. So this year, the native grasses did very well, crested dog's tail, meadow buttercup, vetches, a bit of yellow rattle. But this is certainly a site that we're going to continue cutting and lifting, trying to get the nutrients down. We'll perhaps put a bit more seed in this site as well this autumn. Then on to larger sites. So Abbotsford House, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It used to be a very nice hay meadow. It's been undergrazed. I think, if I am correct, it was last grazed just before COVID. So starting to become a bit more rank. Here we topped the grass. It was quite late in the year, so we couldn't make hay. We topped it and harrowed it with a disc harrow on a tractor, and then seeded the site with volunteers. And it did look very nice this year. Lots and lots of knapweed, some yellow rattle coming through. And hopefully we'll get cattle on here in the spring, which I think is going to be really important at this site for breaking up the thatch and also tackling some of the really undergrazed bits around the edge where we've got things like common hogweed and meadowsweet starting to encroach into the meadow. Mellerstane House is our largest site, 7 hectares. One of my favorite sites because I just never would have expected a big house like this that's had such pristine manicured lawn for probably hundreds of years to be so open-minded and put a whole 7 hectares into this project. So we scarified with horses and grass harrows pulled by tractors, and then seeded again with volunteers. I'm pleased with the progress so far. Again, it's going to be a site that needs time. Going to have to cut and lift, possibly add a bit more seed in this autumn. But it was just so beautiful to walk around. I really love the way they cut all of these paths through the long grasses. All of the visitors commented on how much they preferred it as it is now to the manicured lawn. We had quite some yellow rattle coming through here, lots of orchids popping up just simply from the change in management, lots of bird's foot trefoil, self-heal, eyebright did very well here. Um, so again, a really positive site, and we did a bit of mowing with the horses here, which had a fantastic turnout. The public really enjoyed coming to see them. Needpath Castle, I mentioned before, we used our cattle wearing no fence collars here. The site had not been grazed for 25 years, so getting the cattle back on was really important. We were quite worried about the no fence collars because there's a lot of foot traffic here, a lot of dog walkers. So we put up a temporary electric fence as well to act as a visual aid for the public. And we also had signage where you can scan the QR code and find out exactly where the cows are in real time, which went down really well with the public. And you can see that the grazing is starting to help here. We had lots of meadow cranesbill coming through, lots of knapweed. So again, it's a site that's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of grazing. We're going to hopefully get the cattle back on soon, and hopefully it will just get better every year. So hopefully you can see that we've made a good start, at least. Restoration does take time, but we've got started, and there have been a lot of positives in the project. Almost all of the sites increased in floral diversity, and some of them responded extremely well just to very simple changes in management. So either putting grazing back on or taking grazing off during the summer. One site in particular just exploded in common spotted orchids just from taking the sheep off. So that was really lovely. And we've engaged with hundreds of people so far throughout the project. We've handed out lots of packets of wildflower seeds for people to use in their own gardens. We've had a booklet printed, which you can pick up on our stall outside. And of course, we've engaged with lots of volunteers who helped us to actually seed sites. And as I mentioned earlier, we also provide free advice to anybody who approaches us. But there have been challenges. It's been a really interesting learning experience. The first challenge, I think, is that a lot of the equipment that we put into our original funding application was not fit for purpose. So we found that some of our equipment, for example, the chain harrows don't provide quite enough scarification. If you're using them with horses, you need to weigh down the chain harrows, which then is limited by the fitness of the horses. They have to take breaks. The Trackmaster equipment, so the manual equipment, was marketed to us as the perfect solution for small sites or horse paddocks, but it's very slow. I think what I've realized is it's fine if you're using it on your own site, if you've got a couple of days to make hay, to manage your own site. But when you're paying a contractor to do it on some of the sites in these projects, it adds up, and you could be looking at nearly £1,000 to manage a site, to get it cut and hay made. Haymaking itself is, as I'm sure many of you know, very difficult in this part of Scotland. This year it was almost impossible. There's also the issue of farmers want to make hay kind of from June, when the grass is very palatable and sweet, but that's not good for us in terms of wildlife conservation. We want to leave it later in the year. And when you do get those, a nice stretch of 4 or 5 days of beautiful sunny weather, contractors and farmers are busy trying to cut their own sites. So getting hold of contractors and people to do the work has been quite difficult. Not all of our sites have stock-proof fencing, which has also been limiting. Just getting sites grazed is a lot more economically viable than paying for the haymaking process. We've also had limited staff capacity, so I work like 12 hours a week. When you're managing 34 different sites, that becomes quite difficult. It doesn't go very far. And meadow restoration can take time, so you have to manage people's expectations. It's not going to be very colorful and filled with flowers in its first year. It might take 2-3 years. So you have to manage expectations and keep people motivated. Finally, our plans for the future. My main task at the moment is to increase capacity by training volunteers and building a network of people who can help me to survey sites, so training people in meadow identification. And I'm also hoping to train a group of people in using the TrackMaster, so at least we can involve volunteers in that part of the project and keep the price down. I hope to organise more work parties for seeding sites. We're also going to be running a plug plant trial in spring. So we've ordered several hundred knapweed plants that we're going to be putting into some of the sites that we've seeded and see how they go in comparison to the seed. We need to build a network of local contractors and farmers so that we have many people to get in touch with when the time comes to get these sites either prepared or cut at the end of summer. And we're also exploring corporate sponsorship. So our funding is until March next year. So we're exploring different options for bringing in funding so that we can take on a second intake of sites. So that's me. I think I'm almost about to run over anyway, so I'll leave it there. But thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants and farmers and contractors involved in the project and our funders as well.